in it, so they didn't tune together. So it wasn't the easiest thing to tune. And everything in that radio there, all the parts and transformers and everything, was put in a metal tub, and the tube sockets were wired to the top of it, and the whole thing was filled full of a kind of a wax tar mixture. And of course it was impossible to service it. And if anything went wrong with that chassis, you had to get another chassis for it. With mine, I put mine on the barbecue, and I poured all that tar out of there, and I was able to fix it. And some of the parts were just hanging loose in there. They were just sitting in the tar as they poured it, I guess, and they all fell down to the bottom. But I mounted them with brackets and stuff, and I got it all back together. I didn't put any more tar back into it.
Sounds like a nightmare.
Well, it is. And it's the same thing with every one of them. One of the transformers would open up, and it was no more good. So you don't find many of those around that actually work. But mine does work. And that was in 1923. It was called a portable, weighed about 90 pounds, with the dry cell batteries went in here and in here. And you could get a loop aerial to put on it, but I don't know who'd want to carry it around. It had B batteries too, 135 volts, I believe, and C batteries. Another superhet made in Canada was the Mercury Super 10. Ever heard of that? There was quite a few of them sold in Canada, not in the States. They used the peanut tubes. Of course, they performed about the same way this thing did. Not very good, lots of images. So superhets weren't the answer in 1923. So we'll go to our next slide now. This is, I believe it's a neutral wound. That's what you call a 3-dialer. Had 3 tuning condensers, and it was a good radio. There was lots of 3-dialers around. They were all pretty good radios. And once you got the number off of each dial, the numbers just went 0 to 100. And you had a little logbook. You tuned in a station and you wrote the numbers down. And if you ever wanted that station a week later or so, you just look up in the logbook, dial up those numbers, and there it would be. So once you had a logbook made up of stations, it was easy to find stations. Later to come was a method to couple those 3 large knobs together so they would all turn with the one knob. I think we have one slide of that somewhere in here. Can we try another slide, please? Well, this is a magnetic speaker. I'm going to come to speakers later on, so we'll just delete that one for now.
There's another speaker here.
Yeah, that's another Crossley magnetic speaker. Okay, here's another 3-dialer. You can see the dials, 0 to 100 or anything. And they had a fair amount of volume. They'd run a horn. But, you know, in 1925, the horn disappeared, and it was obsolete. And they came out with the magnetic speaker, which worked a little bit better than the horn. And it could be put inside the cabinet with the radio. It was pretty hard to put a horn in, although some people folded it all up and did that. But the magnetic speaker was more adaptable to cabinets. Now, a magnetic speaker is not a dynamic speaker. I'm going to give you a little talk on speakers now. The horn speaker is basically an earphone with a horn on it. Maybe a large earphone, a metal diaphragm, and a horn. But I showed you that Magnavox horn. That had an actual voice coil, and it was far superior. But there wasn't many of them made compared to the other kind of horns. The other kind of horns just had a metal diaphragm. And with the horn on, they sounded very tinny. They had a response of about 300 cycles to 2,000 cycles. And anything lower or higher was lost. And it sounded like everything was somebody talking through a pipe. But the magnetic speaker had a cone. And the cone was energized by an armature which was mounted with a coil around it, and it was mounted between two poles of a U-shaped magnet. And the armature would vibrate when a music signal or a voice signal was sent into the coil, and the armature was connected to the cone by a metal rod, and it vibrated the cone. Of course, it didn't sound tinny because it wasn't a horn. But low frequencies were bad because of the restrictions on the movement of the armature. It could not be allowed to hit the pole pieces of the magnets, and it was supposed to be spaced exactly in between the two magnets when it was at rest. And the magnetic gap wasn't very big, so consequently the armature couldn't move very much, and low notes couldn't be produced. Now at the other end of the register, up around 2,000 to 3,000 cycles, the armature had to move itself, it had to move the rod connecting it to the cone, and it had to move the cone. And it just couldn't do that more than 3,000 times a second. So all your high frequencies were lost. And the magnetic speaker came out in 1925, and by 1927 it was also obsolete. But they still made a few. Right up to 1939 they used some in farm battery radios. Now, the speaker that was used in these type of radios was called an electrodynamic speaker. It was very much improved over the magnetic speaker. It had a voice coil, a cone, and a field coil. There was some electrodynamics made with magnets. We have a picture of that speaker with a big magnet. I don't know.
This is your inside view of that radio.
Yeah, that's the inside view of that
Shielded radio.
TRF. Doesn't show any shielding between the tubes, but they were all neutralized anyway. The coils and stuff were all, tuning condensers all under that metal shield. You can't see it unless you take it off. Yeah, there's a speaker. That's a dynamic speaker. You can actually see the voice coil up here, and you can see the size of the magnet. Weighed a ton. And it wasn't a very powerful magnet either. You had to travel through all this steel to get up to the coil. So it wasn't very popular. The only place they used that was on the farms. But in the city where they had AC power, they used, instead of that magnet, they used a field coil. Now, I didn't take any pictures of field coil speakers because they look the same as this, except they've got a field coil. And they don't have that big magnet. And another advantage of the field coil was it could be supplied with power from the power transformers and rectifier circuit. It was also used to help filter the power and smooth the power out, removing the AC component from the pulsating DC, smoothing out the pulsating DC into pure DC for the rest of the tubes to operate on.